Let's talk about cryptocurrencies and the blockchain technology. And we're going to address two big issues today. Can these things, these cryptocurrencies, be used reasonably in the future to a reasonable degree as currencies, as money? Or maybe you distinguish between currency and money. We'll see. And secondly, is the blockchain technology the next big thing? A lot of tech people say that. Now, why do we care? I would say because we're objectivists and we care about money. And we don't just care about it because we like to spend it. We care about the honesty of money. All of us would love to see a system where we had honest money that was, free of government influence, chosen by the market. Honest money is the product of our minds, and of course, we revere the rational faculty. So cryptos being all the rage among many libertarians and objectivists, maybe they're onto something, and wouldn't we like to know that? Is there a way to replace fiat currencies with a true market-based currency? There probably is, but is it cryptocurrency? Put another way, is it possible to do an end run around fiat currencies in a way similar to what Uber has done to the regulated taxi industry? That's the kind of thing that incites people's imagination. And finally, I'd say if you're thinking of investing in Bitcoin or any of these cryptocurrencies, what you hear today is a bare minimum of what you need to know. You need to know a lot more than what you'll hear today. And I'm going to say right now, we are not giving investment advice today, okay? We do have three experts on the panel, and I would like, and you've seen their biographies, I am sure, but I'd like to introduce each of them and have them tell us why they're interested in this topic. And let's start with Professor Larry White. He's written two very good books that I recommend, Currency and Competition and the Theory of Monetary Institutions. He's actually a famous monetary economist. I felt so lucky to get him. So, Larry
Thanks,
White.
Jim. Well, I've been interested in privately produced money since decades before Bitcoin. So I've done research on historical free banking systems, which are gold-based with private issue of currency and competition among the issuers. And so Bitcoin is the sort of second time in my life when I've been excited about somehow my research actually becoming relevant. The first was a project for making electronic digital stored valued cards that never really took off. But Bitcoin's pretty amazing, so just as a monetary phenomenon, that's how I approach it, thinking about it as a potential money and how it compares to gold and how it compares to fiat money.
Okay, great. Lars Christensen is a actually famous banker. He's a co-founder of Saxo Bank in Denmark. And I believe, Lars, you as a banker have a particular interest in either Bitcoin or the blockchain or something like this, do you not?
Well, to be honest, I never really managed to convince even my own legal and compliance in the bank about the benefits of offering services in this. So it's more of a private interest at this point. I mean, obviously the bank is, like any other bank, I think, looking at the possibility of deploying blockchain in some way, shape, or form, but we haven't been terribly involved in Bitcoin and the other cryptos as a bank. I, however, have taken an interest in it for several years and have had private investments in it, so I follow it pretty closely. I'm also involved in a project in that area, so I take at least a lot of interest in it.
Okay, great. And Carter Laren, who has been a speaker at OCON before, he's a high-tech guy from Silicon Valley and has been involved in lots of tech ventures, and you may have one going on now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the money expert. That's the guys to my left. But I was a cryptographer long before Bitcoin. From a crypto perspective, what's interesting about Bitcoin is that it solves the distributed trust problem, which people have been working on for quite some time, and it solves it in a way that's practical. The reason the community is excited about it as a currency, and one of the things that I think is interesting about it is, unlike a lot of disruptive technology, the blockchain is kind of going after one of the cores of how society is organized, which is money. And you hear people say it has the potential to have an impact as grand as the invention of agriculture. Right? Now, whether you believe that or not, I don't know. But if you think about agriculture, it led to city-states, which led to the government structures we have now, and they rely on control of the economy and control of money. And Bitcoin threatens to undermine that. So that's what's particularly interesting about Bitcoin to me. And I think from a cultural perspective, you can argue, and I do argue, Bitcoin has already won a cultural battle that objectivists should be happy about. And that is, 20 years ago, if I sat down at a Starbucks with someone and talked about fiat currency or the Federal Reserve, I would be classified immediately as some kind of weird 9/11 conspiracy theorist kook. Well, maybe not 9/11, 20 years ago, but whatever. You're immediately a kook, right? And now you've got millennials who are just regular old millennials, never heard of Ayn Rand, aren't libertarians, don't care about things like this, using the word fiat accurately, and they know what it means, and they know what the Federal Reserve System is, and they know what fiat currency is. That's a cultural win. It's a huge victory. And I think at the very least we should be celebrating that win, whether or not the technology takes off.
That's really well said. I totally agree. When I was researching dozens of videos and tutorials for this, young guys are talking about fiat currency, and I'm thinking, 30 years ago I'm reading von Mises, and I thought just he was the only guy who knew, what, used that word, I guess I would say. So what I'm going to do now is go through, give you a little context. Bitcoin as sort of the poster boy for blockchain technology usage. I'm going to go through a really quick group of slides to give you a little context and history. It'll take about 5 or 10 minutes, less than that probably, less than 10. So what you see on the screen is the abstract from the original Bitcoin academic paper. It's all over the web. It's 9 pages. I can read it and understand about 75% of it. It's very straightforward. Written by someone named Satoshi Nakamoto. We don't even know if he's a real guy. And Carter described the problem he solved. I've seen some references to the Byzantine generals problem in computer science, which basically asks the question, when you're moving information from point A to point B, or from person A to person B over time and space, how do you know that that information has not been tampered with? And he apparently is credited with solving it. He solved it not just with cryptography, he solved it with game theory. Essentially, he's using both computer science and economic incentives, as we'll see in a little bit. And so his system is ingenious, and it is not just about technology. And interestingly, Bitcoin, the network itself, has never been hacked. Peripherals that are built on top of it have, but Bitcoin hasn't. It has no system administrator. It's up 100% of the time. Software is updated on the fly. And I mean, that sounds like some pretty darn good software to me. There's huge interest in the topic. And let's just get a little context on these cryptocurrencies. Here is a display of the biggest 20, the top 20 cryptocurrencies by market cap. That's just the number of coins or tokens they have out times the price. You can see Bitcoin in the upper left is the biggest, Ethereum second. Each one does a little something different. Excuse me, I went too far forward there. Here is an 18-month price on Bitcoin from January of 2017. It rose like a rocket and hit about 19,500. Since then, it's been in a downtrend. This chart ended at, 6,700 today. I saw it quoted around 6,300. There are about 21, well, there will only be 21 million Bitcoins. There are 17 million in existence today. It will peak out, the production will peak out in the year 2140. As far as I know today, nobody is actually pricing anything in Bitcoin, okay? No,
That's
am I
not exactly
incorrect?
true.
Well, there's an exception that proves the rule, which is other cryptocurrencies are priced in Bitcoin.
Thank you. And as
Actually, you can also buy a lot of tech in actually Bitcoin Cash from China, a lot of it.
is
So if you,
Bitcoin Cash pegged to the dollar, or is it,
no,
doesn't it?
no, but if you're going to buy like Antminers or something from Bitmain, you can pay in Bitcoin Cash, and the price is pegged to Bitcoin Cash.
Okay, good, that's interesting, I stand corrected. So Bitcoin has so far a very interesting history. It's only been used in, well, in the interest of time, I'll continue on. This is a this is a graph of the search interest on the web, and it goes from December from the peak today, and you can see it pretty much coincides with the decline in the price, which is not surprising. And this is my all-time favorite Bitcoin chart. So this chart compares the Bitcoin price with other great asset price bubbles. The South Sea bubble was from the year 1711. The Mississippi bubble from 1720, roughly peaked out 1720. Tulip mania 1636 or 7. The gold price peak there toward the bottom is from 1980, I believe. And this just tracks 3 years before the peak, 3 years after the peak. And it's an amazing, if you're a sort of a market watcher or a price watcher like me, you know, this is quite a phenomenon. There are a lot of Bitcoin bulls. I'm just going to quote a couple here. The first quote is from the CEO of NVIDIA, which is a USA-based semiconductor maker, about 150 billion market cap, and they make a lot of the equipment that feeds this industry, and they have profited well from it. The second one from John McAfee, famous security guy. I would say, he did not say, "I will eat my hat." Definitely not for this audience. I could not reprint that. I would give this a make this a bullish headline in the sense that this gives a good use case for cryptocurrencies. And John Stossel did a special on this about a year ago. In Venezuela, in socialist Venezuela, where electricity is free, it's a great place to mine Bitcoin because it's very energy intensive to do so. And of course, they then use Bitcoin to smuggle in items from Nicaragua and Cuba. But if your currency is done and you can't buy anything there anyway because there's no goods to be had, it's a great thing. It does an end run around the Bolivar in Venezuela. And there are some Bitcoin bears. And the divide seems to be between Wall Street and Silicon Valley. So the first one is a manager from the Bank of International Settlements, and he's referring to the price bubble, the Ponzi scheme, meaning there's very few or no holders. There's only resellers, so it's kind of like a Ponzi scheme, though I'm not sure a Ponzi scheme is quite accurate for this phenomenon. Environmental disaster, because it uses so much power. My favorite is Warren Buffett, rat poison squared. I came across a good one by Robert Shiller. You know, he's the Yale housing economist, Nobel Prize winner on Bloomberg a couple days ago. He says, the East Coast is less into it than the West Coast. Silicon Valley is really into it. This, to me, shows that it is not a rational response to new information. I don't think he meant Silicon Valley makes it an irrational response. I think he meant that the whole price phenomenon is a little bit not in his view. This is what I would call a bearish slide. This is what happened to a website called Silk Road, which sold, Bitcoin was its currency of choice. It was shut down in 2014. It sold everything from drugs. I think it sold everything except murder for hire.
I think it might have sold murder for hire.
You think it did?
Yeah.
I thought he wasn't convicted of that.
He wasn't.
Okay. But it's true criminals have taken to Bitcoin because anybody can open a Bitcoin address. They can start sending and receiving Bitcoins without name or identity, and so there's no central authority that can collect the information. Okay, so just that's a little context. Any comments from the panel on the history, on the pricing, on the bullishness, bearishness?
I have a comment. I
Yeah.
think, you know, everyone compares Bitcoin to tulips. You only know that peak retrospectively.
Right.
So any industry you can take that's growing, you could have put cable or internet there and said, look, here it is on the graph.
That's right.
Therefore, it'll be dead. So that's not really an argument. I do think there is a divide between Silicon Valley and Wall Street, but I'll say Bitcoin seems to be very much more grassroots. So even if you look globally, it's generally the lower classes who are more into Bitcoin than the bankers and the governments.
Good,
for what that's worth.
Good perspective, yeah.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, I would comment that it's not just Wall Street, it's Maiden Lane. That's the address of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Right.
Augustin Carstens, who you quote here, was governor of the Bank of Mexico. And he kind of has the nerve to talk about how Bitcoin is not trustworthy when, under his watch, the Mexican peso declined more than 25% in value. So,
Yeah. And you see Jamie Dimon,
That's
right, kind of talk about how horrible Bitcoin is while his daughter is out buying it as he's driving the price down, saying it's horrible. So,
and he's got a research staff working on blockchain.
Yeah, and there's like at the facilities in San Francisco, they're hosting Bitcoin conferences while he's out saying how horrible it is. So, I mean, you know.
So just in these two issues are closely allied, but today I am dividing the Bitcoin currency phenomenon and the blockchain technology ledger, distributed ledger phenomenon into separate issues because I think it is possible this may not work as currency for reasons other than the fact that it's on a blockchain, traded on a blockchain platform. Okay, so if you disagree with that, characters are great. I want to take a few minutes now to get everybody on the same page. I'm going to, well, that's the side I didn't show it. I'd like to get just a little bit into the weeds so I think we understand what it means to have a Bitcoin. Because it took me a while to get my head around this. So let's don't be bullish or bearish. Let's try to be objective. And where are we on the time, by the way? I don't see how far into this are we?
About 20 minutes.
2:08. Okay, we're fine. So what does it mean to own a Bitcoin? Maybe we can sort of pretend we're inventing one here for a moment. Let's suppose you and your friends try to frequently shop for each other, pay for each other's lunches. You shop and you run errands for each other and so forth, and you trust each other. And instead of paying money back every day and say, oh, you owe me this, that, you just decide to keep a ledger, keep a list, and then you settle up at the end of the month. So let's say Alan borrows $20 from Bob, then he buys $10 worth of groceries for Claire and $10 for you. And at the end of the month, or whenever you settle up, instead of you and Claire paying back Alan, who then pays back Bob, you and Claire just pay $10 to Bob. So he gets his original 20 back, everyone's happy, and you go on to the next month. And notice that the description of what I said there kind of boggles the mind just a little bit. It sounds complicated, even though it was simple. But when you put it on a ledger, it makes the problem almost intuitive. It's easy. And by the way, the ledger itself was a great invention in the history of human thought. It's at the base of all business that we do. It's one of those things we take it for granted. Anyway, on this simple ledger, the rules of this ledger are simple. Any member of our group can make an entry, and that's considered sort of truth. But what if an element of trust comes into the ledger, comes into the equation? How do you know someone won't come and make a false entry? So maybe Alan would write on the ledger that he borrowed $15, and when Bob actually handed him a $20 bill, how would you know? How would you verify that? Well, you could use signatures, a unique signature. So if both Alan and Bob had to sign, then you'd be pretty sure that if there was a dispute, that they accepted that the signature. So that sounds good, and it improves the trust, but signatures are easily forged. So now we get into digital signatures. A digital signature is just a series of ones and O's, and it sounds like it'd be easy to copy and forge, but cryptography solves that problem and really makes it hard to do that. So you can use a combination of secret keys, private keys, and cryptographic programs. I'll just put some out there, which I only understand a little bit. And this will prove, if you're on a digital ledger system, that the person who owned that secret key is the person who sent the message. Then they're very reliable, and they're used in all banking today. Now we're still developing a digital coin here. We're not there yet. So we're at the point where every member to the network can add transactions to the ledger, and we know the signed transactions will verify their identity. But what if one can't pay back what he puts in? Let's suppose, for example, that Alan agrees to pay Bob and Claire and you each $100, and each transaction is verified, but at the end of the month he doesn't have the money to pay back. You've got an overspending problem. And we could control that by having everybody put in a specific amount at the founding of the ledger, of the network, and that's all they get to spend. So if everybody puts in $100 and we program the signature procedure so that it's invalid if anybody spends more than that, then that overspending won't happen because the transaction won't be verified. And notice, and this is actually getting to be an important point, if we have a system like this, we never have to settle up in cash. We never have to stop and balance the books. We have a running ledger that goes on all the time. And now we're getting close to a digital currency, because notice, if we never settle up in cash, we'll have to follow the entire transaction history from beginning to end, right up to the point of the most recent transaction, in order to know who has what in their account. We have, therefore, a chain of transactions that we have to know in order to know what's in the network. So this brings us to an interesting question, which is, why do we even have to put money into it in the first place? What if we just say, we're not going to even put money into this system. We're just going to give everybody an imaginary number of Bitcoins or Rand bucks or whatever you want to call it. And we don't put any cash into the system at all. But we still employ the same chained ledger. If we have a system like this, never putting any cash into the system, we have now separated the cash from the ledger, but we could still accept each other's pledges. And I think this is a very controversial kind of a statement, but I see it all over the descriptions about Bitcoin. The currency, the ledger becomes, the chained history becomes the currency. The ledger is the currency. Bitcoin is not redeemable, remember, into anything outside its own network. So whether you think that's a problem or not, into whether it's going to be ultimately used as money, that maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but that question is, I think, at the heart of the question, can this be used as money? So, sorry, I'm going to pause here and ask if we have any comments from the panel about that last question, that last issue.
I would say that the tech community is really asking the question of, do you need money? And they're really answering it by saying, no, you need efficiency of bartering. You got a bartering system, you need it to be efficient, because bartering directly is inefficient. And money is a solution to that, but the blockchain is a separate solution to efficiently bartering between people. To the extent that people accept Bitcoin as the default system for bartering and keeping track of that, then it works. To the extent that they don't, it doesn't. And the analogy I would use, a lot of people kind of say, oh, well, anyone can just invent a new cryptocurrency, and therefore there's really an unlimited supply, right? That's even more true about fiat currency than it is. You got to compare it to something, and if you compare it to what exists now, it's actually better in terms of that, on that respect at least. And the other thing is, it's ignoring the power of the network. It's like saying Facebook is just a bunch of code, so anyone could have a bunch of code on servers, and they would be just as valuable as Facebook. That's not true. Facebook has billions, over a billion at least, users. That's what makes Facebook valuable, right? Because it's become the default place to go for social networking, right? And so if a cryptocurrency, whether it's Bitcoin or anything else, becomes the default place for people to keep track of their transactions, that will be very hard to unseat by, if I just come up with something and say, here's an alternative.
I think I wouldn't want to identify the currency with the ledger completely, because what the ledger keeps track of
I think this is interesting, and I didn't make this up.
is transfers of ownership of an asset. So there has to be an asset.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just arbitrary numbers that are transferred. And what the ledger keeps track of is that what you're spending is something you previously were verified to have received. So that prevents the overspending problem. But we already know that we can have monetary systems that are based on money of no intrinsic value. That's what we live with today. That's what the US dollar is today. And the danger of the US dollar, of course, is that there's nothing that restricts its supply. And we've seen in history lots of fiat currencies explode when governments ran the printing presses. But Bitcoin has a built into the program a limit on the issue of new
Larry,
coins.
does it bother you that that the dollar, which is a fiat currency, and most other fiat currencies at least have a legacy from a better standard, a metal standard, and that the series of transactions, even though they go over many decades, impart value? In other words, value was earned when money was sound, and it's passed on. That's been diluted by inflation, diluted by fiat issue. But it's that legacy that comes, so that you can say that the currency that we get today, if I put $100 into this ledger, it has value that comes from decades ago that was, quote, legitimate. I hope I'm making myself clear.
Yeah.
But this Bitcoin is made up, out of whole cloth.
Well, that is remarkable, and that is why I wrote a paper, I think it was 1989, saying, well, there are kind of two ways to secure the value of money. The traditional way, and the way that gold-backed money worked, was you have a banknote or you have a deposit, you can redeem it for gold. You get your money back. Right? It's a value guarantee. There's another possible way to secure value, and we see it in limited edition art prints, and that is we guarantee that there aren't going to be more than a certain number issued. So it's a quantity guarantee. So you could have that as a way of securing the value of this intrinsically, or this asset that can be created at very low cost. But who would want that in money? In money, you want to know what the value is going to be, not what the quantity is going to be. Yeah. Well, turns out I was about several $100 billion worth of wrong. It is the cryptocurrencies are assets, and so that's remarkable. They kind of lifted themselves by their own bootstraps. But we want to be forward-looking. We want to ask, where does it go from here? And as you indicated, it's a long way from adoption as a commonly accepted medium of exchange.
Yeah. Okay. I want to just, there's one last, what we have here is we haven't yet invented a Bitcoin. What we've invented is a cryptocurrency or a digital currency. But there's one more big step to Bitcoin, which makes it a Bitcoin. And we need to just get into that briefly.
Before you do that, could I think, get to the bottom of what this is really about, in my view, because we're not really getting there. Let me explain to you what a blockchain is. A blockchain is a system whereby you do a number of transactions, you put them together in a block, you confirm that block, and then you move on to the next block. That block you come in a complicated way secure that you can't corrupt subsequently, which is a really interesting point here, that once it's in the blockchain, correctly executed, you cannot subsequently fiddle with those transactions. So you have a certain degree of finality to the transactions, which is very important. The real problem that blockchain tries to solve is what is the fundamental problem in normal banking, in central banking, in fiat currency, is that you have a single point of failure. You have a central bank that could go under, you could get a terrible government, your currency could go under because it becomes hyperinflated or whatever. Actually, the average survival time of a fiat currency is 27 years. Now, we don't think about that in Denmark or in the US, but if you're in Venezuela or you're in Zimbabwe or something, this is a very real problem, right? And the reason it does that is because of poor politics, poor monetary systems, poor monetary management. So, and the reason for that is always that it's in the hands of one single point that can fail, as is literally nearly every series of transactions that we try to keep for the future. So the blockchain, and that's why it has the currency, the blockchain says instead of Lars confirming this or the Federal Reserve confirming this set of trades, we spread it out to all of you guys. You all keep a copy of it. So if you have all confirmed it, then it's very, very difficult for somebody to subsequently corrupt it or for that to go under. And even if all of you disappear, because you sit in a country that forbid Bitcoin or blockchain or whatever, all of you will still manage to move the ledger forward, right? Then the reason you have the currency is because why should you do that? You know, if you're sitting there spending your time and your computer energy confirming a block and a ledger, why would you do that unless you had some form of reward for that? And that's why you typically have the currency in connection with a blockchain. You get a reward every time that you participate in this network of creating this distributed ledger as it is without the single point of failure. That is the bottom line idea behind blockchain. You can avoid that. You can make an excellent blockchain from a functional point of view with what's called permission users, where just the three of us, we have a computer each, we agree that we all three confirm a block. But there's just a problem that if the three of us are corrupted, or even the majority of us are corrupted, then you can't trust us anymore. Actually, it works much quicker because it's much easier to reach consensus between three participants in a network than tens of thousands in a network. So it'll take longer time to confirm a Bitcoin block. But the main reason you do it is to avoid this single point of failure. And hence you have permissioned blockchains, for example, Ripple, which is made by the banks. It's only in the most distant kind of ways comparable to Bitcoin and Ethereum, because that's a permission blockchain. That's a series of banks that agree to basically confirm these transactions. It has a lot of advantages that they can transact with each other quickly and with finality, which I hope we can get a chance to speak a little bit more about, because that's another problem in the system. You don't have finality. You transfer money, somebody can pull it back. And if in the meantime you handed out an asset, you have a problem. I tried it with Lehman. So that's what blockchain is really about, and that's why you have the currency, right? Now, obviously, if the currency doesn't have some degree of value, then it's very difficult still to get people to do it, although there are examples of people doing it for no value, but because they do a little puzzle or something that gives them a coin. So it's very, very important to understand that there's distributed ledgers on blockchain, which is a basic idea. That's Bitcoin, that's Ethereum. Everybody participates, hence it cannot sort of disappear just because one of you or even a group of you are corrupted. Secondly, you can have a permission blockchain where it's a small group of people that confirm it. That can be corrupted, and hence, in my view, is not a true blockchain. And thirdly, and in those ones you don't need coins because you have it in Ripple, but we can just agree that we all pay the cost of our computers. It's not a problem. So that is why you have the currency, and that is why you have Bitcoin, is to really avoid the single point of failure more than anything else, right? And a single point of failure is everywhere. Your lawyer is a single point of failure. Your bank is a single point of failure. Your government is a single point of failure. The president of your housing association is a single point of failure if somebody's holding all the records, right? And that's what blockchain is really trying to solve.
Okay, so Lars just went through about 3 of my 5 next talking points.
Sorry.
So that was great, which is great. But let me just summarize what happens to create a blockchain, a new block on a blockchain. So we've built this little network. When a network member wants to send money to another one, they transmit that transaction all over the network. And this transmission is, like he said, it's a distributed ledger. Instead of having a central authority that's in charge of the the ledger and which could corrupt it in various ways. This information is distributed to all of you, so you can just update your ledgers with the record, with what's sent out. However, that by itself would be a very bad idea, because how do you know that, corrupt information is not being distributed to you and you and you? So you have to have a way to verify it, and this is where the miners come in. So I send out we transact, I send out that transaction to every member on the blockchain. Miners listen to this, they monitor this, they collect a group of transactions, like Lars said, they put them into a block, and then once they've properly assembled that block, they transmit that back out to everyone, so that they now have a valid list of transactions, everyone. But how does everyone know it's valid? Because of this brilliant little system that Satoshi figured out, this proof of work system, where the miners will solve a cryptographic problem and attach proof of work to it, and thereby prove that their transaction is correct and valid. And this thing is very ingenious, because when you get into how it works, it's self-correcting. If you have a problem, along the way, more miners will come along and correct the last problem. But Lars raised a few interesting questions, and why don't we just get into all those right now, all these money questions. So before we do, let's just... First bullet point is controversial. The ledger is the currency. As I said, I didn't make up that characterization. That is what many, if not most, of the proponents say. Digital signatures allow you to make transactions anonymously. The trust comes from the decentralized network, and the money supply is limited. So inflation is either limited or known, right? Now, here is a list. I thought this would be a good departure point for discussion by some experts or opinion leaders. We all learned in the 9th grade that money has to have these kind of qualifications. Money is supposed to be, we all learned, it's supposed to be durable, portable, divisible, scarce, provide a store of value, and widely accepted. My guess is if it doesn't do all those top 5 things, it won't be accepted. Obviously, it's divisible. You can divide digitally a Bitcoin. I think the system can divide it into 0.0007 times 1 divisions, and that's called a Satoshi. So it's obviously divisible. What about its durability? What if what if the lights go out? What if the electricity goes off? Well, you're probably okay, because you have a dispersed network. One part goes down. Probably won't go out all over the world. One thing I've heard about, what about an electromagnetic pulse? Somebody explodes a 40 megaton bomb in space. Does that give you pause, Lars? They take the whole banking system
That's
down?
not unique to crypto. I mean,
Right. Right.
You're all screwed if that happens.
Right. Right, but does that mean? But I guess what I'm asking is, if people don't see that risk, they might accept it. But if they see that risk, then they'll take something else's money, right?
I mean, you can make Faraday cages and keep servers in there that have backups of the blockchain, just like banks probably do in case there's some catastrophe.
Okay, it's probably pretty durable. It's obviously very portable. You can, between any 2 computer nodes, you can,
Well, the main record of, for example, Bitcoin is a massive piece of code, because it shows every single transaction ever made since 3rd of January 2009. I think it was launched, right? So that's not being transmitted between normal participants, but that is sitting on tens of thousands of computers. So if we ever recover electricity in that scenario, it's still around. Whereas a whole lot of other things may not be able to survive an outage of a month or 2 of electricity, right? Actually, there will be absolutely no problem with the Bitcoin ledger, because you'll all have it.
How about the scarcity factor? Or maybe I'm not sure, maybe rarity would be a better word, but the scarcity factor. What about competing currencies? Why can't anyone come along and do another Bitcoin 2.3?
Well, anybody can, but each new coin has its own blockchain. And those are not as valuable because there aren't as many participants and it's not as widely acceptable. So there is this network property that's already been mentioned. It's like asking, well, what about dollars? Can't Zimbabwe print lots and lots of Zimbabwe dollars? And the answer is yes, but it doesn't drive down the value of the US dollar. It changes the exchange rate. And so the value of the marginal cryptocurrency is the cost of creating a marginal cryptocurrency. But the ones that have established sizable networks, and especially Bitcoin, their value is not diluted by the creation of new coins.
And I would again remind you to compare it. You have to always ask compared to what, right? We're not comparing this to some ideal monetary system that doesn't exist. What are we, over $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities with a $19 trillion GDP? We've already broken our monetary system. They already print as much as they want. So worrying about whether someone will compete with Bitcoin is a little bit disingenuous if that's the argument. There's arguments against Bitcoin, but that's not one of them.
I'm just positing the scarcity element of it. It's purely the scarcity
Right, and
element.
my point is you got to compare it to the scarcity of the dollar, which is, it's not scarce.
Right.
At all.
Well, I would say the beauty of Bitcoin is that because it was put into the world and it has to be confirmed by this large number of people on the distributed ledger, it has a very clear goal for, as you are saying, as and when it will issue additional currencies. So it would be extremely hard to corrupt and all of a sudden say it's not going to be 21 million, there's going to be 210 million. And if somebody could corrupt that, it would probably implode immediately, right? Because who would want if you could change these things, right? I think however, you have to look at it like Bitcoin is like a first generation. It was very well thought out. It was building on a lot of prior cryptography, as you know. Actually, that was not a huge invention in itself, other than putting things together in a new way and gaining adoption in the network. But Bitcoin can't do very much. It's very clunky. You can't program anything complicated into it. You can only use it really for transactions. So then you had what we call second generation, which is Ethereum, which is essentially a slightly more efficient Bitcoin, but with a built-on programming language, so you can actually tell the money to do different things, so called smart contracts. So if I want to make a long-term commitment to sending a Bitcoin every month to Jim, then I can put it into a contract, and I cannot stop sending that Bitcoin to Jim every month. So this is some of the very interesting applications. But even Ethereum is also pretty clunky. I mean, Bitcoin can do about 7 transactions per second. Ethereum can do about 15 transactions per second. Actually, to get your particular transaction prioritized in a Bitcoin or Ethereum block, you have to attach a fee to it, which is why you have these currencies. And currently, to do a transaction on Bitcoin is like $20 or something. So it's not particularly efficient. It's very slow. You can only do 7 transactions a minute. It costs money. Ethereum a little bit the same. So in my view, these two will not be the long-term solution of winners here. There may be a few anarchists and ultra-libertarians that think this is fun. So you can't kill it.
Isn't the high cost built into the system?
Well, it's just the lack of ability to scale. I mean, Visa does, as far as I remember, about 2,000 transactions on average per second.
And capable of 17,000.
Yeah, at peak hours, at peak moments, it can do up to like 20 or 30 or 40,000. So obviously 7 transactions a second doesn't go very far, right? So and there's lots of projects out there dealing with that currently. So in my view, Bitcoin has, of course, a certain affinity. It is a first mover advantage. But in my view, I mean, this guy thinking it's going to go to $1 billion, it's a complete joke. It's much more likely to go to 1. And it will certainly be closer to 1 than to 1 billion, 1 million, that's for sure. I mean, that is as sure as you can get about anything in my view. Yeah. And this goes for all of these first, second generation attempts at doing this. They're very smart, but we know things today, 10 years later, compared to Bitcoin. That means we can develop it much, much smarter. It's like, Ford Model T or whatever it was called was a brilliant invention, but we're not still driving them, right? So this will develop as anything else. I'm very skeptical of the currencies out there, because also they have been used for a large number of criminal activities, which means they are more or less refused by the normal banking system. So you can't really convert Bitcoin into the fiat system. Very few banks in Europe would accept, if you go and say, I made $1 million on Bitcoin, they'll just say, hey, I don't want it. So these currencies, in my view, are doomed, but that has nothing to do with the long-term possibilities in this technology, which is very, very interesting.
So you're talking now about blockchain technology, and I'm speaking.
And more
Well-built
coins.
Just to focus this, what about this idea of a store of value? Now, when I think of money, I think of something that will store value over decades, at least sound money, if I'm looking for sound money. And what about this? The very price action of it seems to disqualify it. If it would ever stabilize, okay, perhaps you could infer that stability over time. But what about that? And yeah, go ahead, Larry.
If you've got it, go.
Yeah, there are at least two dimensions to being a reliable store of value. The one you mentioned is, can you trust it 20, 30 years down the road? And the other is from week to week. I mean, you don't want to keep your rent money in Bitcoin because it could drop 20% tomorrow. So that's been one of the biggest barriers to getting wider acceptance of it.
I would argue that the way to look at this is Bitcoin is a proof of concept, right? And this is kind of what Lars was saying, right? Bitcoin is a proof of concept. I'm a little bit more bullish on Bitcoin just because it's also established itself as sort of a reserve currency for how a lot of these markets work. So I don't think it's going to go to zero.
Reserve currency for other cryptos.
Yeah, it's how you get in and out of other cryptos right now, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So it has some legs, but it will be replaced eventually by more.
So it's interesting to me that we're 10 years into this, and I checked the 500 top online sites, I believe 3 of them accept Bitcoin.
Sure, but we're 10 years into, it's like saying, who brought up the Model T, right? It's like 10 years after the Model T, we didn't have Lamborghinis, right? This takes time, and we're 10 years after a white paper, right? White papers are nothing.
Okay, so that 10 years is meaningless in the, okay.
I think so, yeah.
But the store value discussion is very, very important, because if we cannot argue that there's any additional value to the pure utility of these tokens that are out there, then of course they're all dramatically overvalued, because none of them really provide any real substance or any real practical activity, with the possible exception of Ethereum, right? So if it's really just the utility of these tokens for making this just like the oil in the engine, then the pricing should be totally different, and that's very, very possible. There is also, I think, the possibility that you could, because I agree with what was being said, that what's the basis of the US dollar, right? That's just a bunch of promises. So if you can be sufficiently convincing in building a community around a cryptocurrency, I think some people might accept it. And also I would agree that a store of value does not necessarily connect to its practical use as a means of payment. If you look at the Greek city-states before BC, they actually had they killed each other for gold, and they kept it in warehouses well protected. But when they actually were paying something, they were using cattle and wheat and stuff like that.
What about the argument, though, and this would be for everyone, that the dollar, for example, is worth it's valuable for what the dollar will buy, and it will buy a lot in the USA, in a very broad, deep, safe, rights-oriented economy, surrounded by a blue water navy that will prevent people from taking your property. And the very fact that we have that protection from the government, who has a monopoly on the currency, which, although it's been inflated, is a limited issue, and which has a legacy way back to a more sound standard. Doesn't that give, well, maybe someone would address specifically, what if government will not enforce contracts or enforce restitution for harm for transactions paid in Bitcoin?
Well, I think the blockchain can solve that. I mean, smart contracts can solve restitution.
Okay, so
Right,
now we're
so-
into blockchain and smart contracts. So you think, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's classic examples of, if you look at any company that's disintermediating and like taking out the middleman between the supply and demand of something, right? Uber's a classic example. Theoretically, that can be, you could design Uber on, you probably wouldn't use Ethereum, but some Ethereum variant. That's as long as it's Turing complete and you can do enough transactions, then you could design a system that connects, I want a ride, he's got a car, we get paid. If something goes wrong, you could have rules for how that gets undone. You could have it managed by the community so that if things that we aren't predicting pop up, there can be changes to the code. At the end of the day, no, there's not judges and police. But for most of what happens, we don't need judges and police. They're edge cases. And I would argue, whenever small government people talk to statists about, for example, doing something without the government, roads are the classic example, right? The statist is always like, well, who will build the roads, right? And if you have an answer to well, how would the roads be built exactly? The correct answer is, I don't know. No one knows. You can't know. That's the purpose of the free market. You don't know how the roads will be built. But if people want roads,
Well, if that's
they'll
the
be
case,
built.
is there any purpose for government and commerce at all?
In commerce, I would say no.
Okay.
But I agree that it's a part of the solution rather than a problem, right? Because what if your courts are corrupted, or what if they lean on the side of the most powerful or the most wealthy, right? If you build a smart contract correctly, you have the money. Of course, you can build it unintelligently or wrong, but at the end of the day, I mean, I can remember I had a boss that told me, you know what, Lars, possession is 99% of the law. The guy that has the money, he also controls the law because of the complexity of actually going into a legal system and pay for it. Here, you will have your money. If you and I have made a deal, we made an appropriate smart contract, which is a little bit hard to do now because it requires specialized knowledge, but will be a standard run-of-the-mill application in the future. I can't run away from the fact that I have to pay you every month or whatever we agree. You will just get your money, and that's it. You won't have to go to
Okay,
any
so
court.
this is a great time to explore, I think, a few of the issues with blockchain that have occurred to me and probably to other people. So there's one entry point into the blockchain, and there is no recourse, as you mentioned earlier briefly, once a transaction is made. Don't people want recourse? So for example, let's suppose we use blockchain to track the provenance of my title to my car, and somebody gets my private key, they hack in, they steal my car. Where do I go? I can imagine a system run on the blockchain comes out with, blockchain 2.0, where they install a DMV that you can, that you can appeal to, right? So,
Can you imagine insurance agencies and escrow agents on the blockchain managing
Sure.
those transactions? Right? I mean, there's some things you don't want reversed. And in fact, a lot of halal guys, for example, they take cash because they've got a problem with people reversing charges on their Visa and claiming whatever, and you've already eaten the falafel or whatever it is. It's done, right? I shouldn't be able to negate my Starbucks purchase. So in that case, you don't want it to be reversible. For larger items, maybe you do, and maybe you need other parties involved, and maybe you need an escrow agent, and maybe you need insurance, and maybe the insurance, if you use his code, the insurance will insure you, but if you use his, well, it's kind of wonky, and no one really trusts it, so they're not going to insure you.
Larry, did you okay?
At some point, I'd like to talk about Bitcoin versus gold.
I think now would be a great time.
Head-to-head.
Yes.
So we've already talked about some of the problems that Bitcoin faces, and you just talked about one, which is the huge incumbent advantage of the fiat dollar. That's a problem for Bitcoin. It's also a problem for reestablishing a gold standard from the bottom up. We talked about the problem of volatility, and that's especially a problem for Bitcoin. It's a slight problem for gold, but the week-to-week variation in the value of gold is much less than that in Bitcoin. And As far as the sort of incumbency, as far as establishing a critical mass, right now there's an estimated $1.7 trillion worth of gold in private hands in the form of coins and bullion, which is more than 10 times the amount of Bitcoin in private hands. So I think gold has a sort of a leg up on establishing a private currency. What Bitcoin people will tell you its great advantage over gold is, and one of the early developers of the idea, Nick Szabo, wrote a paper describing what he called a bit gold system, and it's kind of one of the bases on which Bitcoin was established. He wanted to establish a gold-like system, but one where you could have remote transfer of assets and not worry about who owns a vault. And that's supposed to be the great advantage of cryptocurrencies, that there's no vault that can be seized. And I mean, that's a real advantage, but we have to trust or lobby to keep government out of seizing vaults. We also have to keep it out of Bitcoin. Some of the more rabid proponents, the Bitcoin maximalists, they call themselves, want to say that it's uncensorable.
Yeah.
But I think that's an exaggeration. Government can at least drive it underground to where you have to be pretty sophisticated to find people who will transact with you and to transact with them without using exchanges, because those are points of failure.
But talk about how you would join
Yeah, so
Bitcoin and gold. I mean, with gold, of course, you'd still have a secure, obviously, a secure vault somewhere.
Right, but it's no longer the case that you need to carry around gold coins to make transactions. That hasn't been true for centuries. But people are now launching projects, or at least a dozen in the works, to make claims to gold in a secured vault transferable on a blockchain, so that you don't have to go through the vault keeper to make a transaction. You can do it on the outside, and it can be validated. It can be counterfeit proof. So that seems to me, if governments will allow it, to be a plausible path to a private payment system.
Yeah. Lars,
So I'd say the whole thing about Bitcoin as a new gold, I think, is not very credible. You know, it was never created with that purpose. Satoshi didn't make it because he wanted to make gold 2.0. He made it to, I think, even whoever that person or group of person was, they never really suspected they would be as big as it has become. I'm pretty sure this was an intellectual exercise, and nobody really believed in it in the early years. They and that's quite clear in the white paper that they did it for doing a payment system, right? Now, subsequently, all the fans, and I'm not that dissing. I made a lot of money on Bitcoin, so I don't have any issue with it. But as it turned out, it didn't work as a means of payment because it doesn't have scalability. Then people invented the idea that now it's gold 2.0. You know, this was never discussed in the first couple of years around any of the Bitcoin fanatics whatsoever. So that's like something that has come later because it didn't really work adequately in the other aspects. And you have a bunch of diehard enthusiasts out there that will promote that. But it's funny with the vaults, actually. My very good friend Nicholas, who owns Bitcoin Swiss, which is probably the biggest regulated broker of Bitcoin and Ethereum and these things in Switzerland and Zug, he has just opened, for a couple of years working on it, a vault where they also store gold. You have to go through 7 separate massive doors to get in there, because if you hold a significant amount of Bitcoin, you certainly don't want that connected to the internet. You hold it in what's called cold storage. He's sponsoring my ice hockey team, so we invented the term ice cold storage. But the way you do that is taking the computer off the internet. And that's not enough, because what if you have a bad employee or somebody that can get to that computer? So you are actually now, funnily enough, storing these computers in vaults that are also gold vaults. And if a government wanted to come
with a trusted agent.
So bizarrely, you are actually going down that route. But I mean, some of these people, you have people out there that are half billionaires or billionaires that put in a few $1,000, right? And now they have to protect that, and that you can only do by storing that data extremely securely. And they actually, this vault, I haven't seen it yet, but it sounds pretty fantastic. And they actually also hold normal gold reserves in there.
Go ahead, one more, and then I really want to get some questions in because we've got about 20 minutes left.
I just want to make the comment that, there have been a lot of attempts to join blockchain and gold. I think the answer might be something that bothers a lot of us who are system builders, and that might be, maybe they'll be both, right? Maybe there will be more than one monetary system and there's exchanges between them. And when I buy Starbucks, maybe I will use a derivative of Bitcoin that is fast and can handle the transactions and is immutable. But maybe for other things, I'll need gold, and there'll be some gold-backed version of it. From what I've seen, all the attempts to link gold and any kind of blockchain have been fraught with practical issues that have kind of killed them all.
In principle, you can also always connect Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency and call it a stable coin. I put a pool of $1 billion, and I say, I just mark some coins and say each of them represent
Tether does
a dollar.
that.
Tether's a very good example, and we already know that potentially there's some significant problems
But then
with that. But then you have
that's not a currency, that's a transfer system.
then you have the single point of failure again. What if something happens to my account where I hold my $1 billion, right? So, but I think that's part of the solution because, for example, what you're saying, Lightning Network that you're building on top of Bitcoin exactly for small, quick transactions. Apart from that, also now not really working for larger transactions. But you could easily say that in this context, because Starbucks want dollars and I want dollars, so in a short span of time, 24 hours, 48 hours, I connect that particular fraction of a Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency to some kind of more broadly accepted asset, right? And this is what Generation 3 and Generation 4 are building into it. Again, I think, building all this stuff on top of Bitcoin, in my humble view, is it's a little bit like having a Fiat 500 and putting gold cover and new tires on it to make it look nicer, but it still has a Fiat 500 engine in the inside, right? So I think it's a wrong way to go. Do Generation 3, do Generation 4. As I said, I'm working on one. I can't say very much about it, but we're actually trying to deal with the store value in multiple ways, because we wanted to store value because that'll make it much more attractive to the project. One, that we have actually, believe it or not, anthropologists sitting analyzing what created value. Why was it mussel shells here and 2-ton stones there? And why was it gold in this city-state and wheat in that city-state? So analyzing that. And the second thing is that we're looking at with some economists is doing the equivalent of an algorithmic central bank that automatically controls the supplies depending on certain degrees of stability that we want to achieve. So there's just so much coming in this space right now where things like Bitcoin and to some extent Ethereum are so Model T that it doesn't make sense to fix them.
Well, with that cryptic comment, there's so much you could say about blockchain. There's so many use cases been proposed. But again, 10 years in, there's not much done yet, so the jury's out. Now, I want to open to questions. Please.
So I think I've written about 14,000 words on Bitcoin, so I have my own opinions. And this being an objectivist conference, I have two temptations to present an opinion in the thinly guised
question.
Please. Yes, sir. I guess my question is, how does lending and borrowing work if the store of value problem isn't solved?
I think that's a good question. People have been talking about Bitcoin banking as one way to have a lighter payments layer, but banking means you have lending, and lending means you have to have people willing to borrow. And in a unit of account that's all over the map, people don't want to borrow.
Yeah, to me it's the same question. How do you save? How do you have savings? You can't have lending without savings, but anyway. Yes,
I'm not sure I understand the question because it's how do you lend it? I mean, that would be the same way as you lend money. You can already short Bitcoin today. Somebody can lend you the Bitcoin and you short it. But of course, you're then dependent on a series of agreements that will not have the same degree of automation, perhaps, than as Bitcoin itself has. But you could easily build that into a smart contract again. So I don't really see any big issues with that technically. But of course, the fluctuations may make it pretty unattractive for most people to do it.
I think he's talking about fractional reserve lending. I assume.
Oh, okay. In that sense, sorry. Okay, no, that was one of those problems. But I guess many people are skeptical of that, right?
Yeah.
Hey, my question's about trust. So with traditional currencies, you're trusting the nation to still stay solvent and keep their currency valuable. With gold, you're trusting that enough people still will think it's pretty and want it. But with Bitcoin, you're trusting that 51% of the computing power will not be controlled by a bad actor.
Kind
And this actually happened 4 years ago. One party controlled 51% for a short time of the computing power. So how is this sort of direct democracy approach to trust any better than trusting a nation?
Well, I think as time moves
Carter,
forward,
do you want to explain real quickly what works? The blockchain is updated on a consensus basis, and consensus is is created by a majority of the computing power.
right, so there's a large number of miners, there's a large number of nodes on the Bitcoin network that verify transactions, and if any one nefarious party gets a hold of 51%, they could theoretically start forging transactions in a way that would basically fork the blockchain down like a path that was invalid. First of all, as Bitcoin becomes more popular, the likelihood that anyone gets 51% computing control diminishes. Second, there's an interesting psychological problem that you have, which is if you actually own 51% of the mining, it's not in your best interest to destroy the value of Bitcoin. I mean, you're screwing yourself. You want the network to be safe, and you want the value to be high because you're making a lot of money if you own 51% of the mining. So I think
But couldn't you paint the tape by forging a transaction that gave him a false impression about
right,
what
but it
was
would
worth?
destroy so again, we're getting back to this thing where Bitcoin doesn't have intrinsic value. So, right, if the price of Bitcoin is say 10K for a Bitcoin, and that's discovered, you better believe the price will plummet next day. And the fact that you have a bunch of Bitcoin, you just destroyed your own stored value, in quotes.
But I agree with you. It's a significant problem, and that's a problem with proof of work, is that because the more efficient you get, the more it will tend to concentrate. So you actually have a recreation of concentrated groups. And actually, I would say the four biggest miners in the world probably control 51% of the network between them, and there's a small problem with those because they're all in one country. And do you know what country that is? China.
China,
So there could be an actor that maybe said, well, I don't like Bitcoin, and I'd like to give you an offer you can't refuse. And then you could destroy it that way. And again, you couldn't really, because it would only result in a fork, that it would result in two different versions. So even if you had a big problem, the 49% or whatever that percentage would be could actually decide to continue that fork. So the other ones would have cut themselves off in a separate fork. But it's a very major problem, particularly because of the concentration power in mining, because it's a question of having the best software, having the best access to cheap electricity, have the greatest benefit of scale. And that does lead to an ever bigger concentration. And that is why you don't use proof of work in the new change. You use what's called proof of stake, which is a totally different matter, where you randomly, and you can mathematically prove randomness, that you randomly pick either 100 people or 500 people in this group every time you make a block, and then you will not be able to know in advance you're going to get selected, and the chances of corrupting that system is like, less than finding one specific sand corn on one beach in a specific country somewhere in the world, if you construe it correctly. So proof of work is also dead. That's another problem with Bitcoin. And proof of stake is clearly the new solution, is already employed by most new generation blockchains.
And even Ethereum is switching to proof of stake at this point.
The Casper project. Yeah.
The other thing I'll mention really quickly is if you look at the hacks that have happened, none of them have been against the blockchain itself, but they have happened against different exchanges and things. But when you see, like there was a few months ago, I think there was a hack against some multi-sig system. The community is very responsive. In fact, because so many people have a stake in things going well, in this example, an attacker had figured out how to exploit something and started stealing money, and the community saw the exploit and stole all the rest of the money from those accounts so they could give it back to the people faster than the attacker could. That kind of dynamic response is something that I think you only get with a large number of stakeholders who care about the system in a very visceral way.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, so let's keep going on the questions here. See how many we can get in.
So this isn't related to my question, but I'm working on a hardware project related to proof of work, so I super disagree that it's dead. But not enough time for that. But I just wanted to ask,
Take that
I think,
offline later.
aren't you holding Bitcoin to a very high standard given that it's so young? Like in the 90s, people would laugh at like dating on the internet, or like there was a very failed company that delivered groceries from the internet, right? And like today, Amazon Prime now, right? You get it in 2 hours. So like, shouldn't you be looking at like the early adopters, right? So if you're in China, Bitcoin is an amazing store of value. Like you can't cross the border of China with more than $50,000, but you can leave with $100 million in a USB, or like even in your mind, right? You can just remember your secret key and walk out. So like, isn't it actually already an amazing store of value? Like suppose you show up somewhere and by the time you sell the Bitcoin, you have only 50% left, but like that's 50%, you know?
Yeah, I would agree that Bitcoin is being held to an irrational standard because it's so young. And people talk about the volatility of Bitcoin, and I think, of course, it's not used in transactions right now because it is very volatile. I do agree that Bitcoin isn't the end-all, be-all blockchain currencies, but yeah, I think it'll take a while for things to settle out and become adopted as actual currencies of exchange, and we're just not there yet. It's just super, super early. People don't know. We tend to think that everyone knows what Bitcoin is, but people don't know what Bitcoin is, and it's not as popular as this audience might think it is, and so it's just way too early. I agree with you.
I think one of the events that really established Bitcoin's usefulness was the attempt to levy a tax on all the savers in Cyprus to bail out the banking system. And there were exchange controls, so you couldn't use the ordinary banking system to get your money out of before it was taxed. But people discovered that they could expatriate it with Bitcoin. And so it's a very useful tool against governments that are trying to take people's wealth.
And it's why China shut down their exchanges for exactly the reason that you point out, is their capital controls. There are no exchanges in China anymore precisely because of that reason.
But they are the 4 largest miners in the world.
Yep. Yes.
Thank you.
I have a question on an entirely different level. I would like to see one of these currencies succeed and replace the fiat currencies, which are so deleterious to our financial health. But the fiat currencies and inflation of the money supply seem to me to be necessary to finance the welfare state. You cannot have a welfare state financed by taxation at a certain point. You have to resort to inflation. If Bitcoin starts, or something of that order, starts to succeed, maybe comes into this. If it starts to succeed, won't governments spare no efforts to shut it down? And given that the miners use the amount of electricity of a small country, it seems it would be pretty easy to find and arrest the miners and stop this so that the welfare state can go on, which is what the majority wants to happen. They want the welfare state.
I actually think that's the biggest threat, is what you've mentioned. And people are actually, I know a company putting miners in orbit intentionally to try and mitigate that. I don't think it actually stops it, but I think that that's the biggest threat. It's not the technological threat, it's guys with guns who own your lives, basically, that you're living in a...
But if anybody remotely thinks that is going to be allowed to happen, I mean, a nation state and a government wants control over its monetary system is absolutely crucial. So it's not going to happen. So the real question is to find where's the balance where you can improve efficiency inside a system that's accepted by the forces that there are. So these, I'm sorry to say, these pipe dreams are very nice, but there's absolutely no way that Bitcoin or any of these other ones are going to be allowed to displace the traditional monetary systems for the reason you say and for a number of other reasons. So that's just a dream for some people, right? But there is a possibility that you can make a lot of stuff very much more efficient, and build in things that are acceptable to governments and to central banks, so that there's still a possibility to do great projects. But you will never have a completely uncontrolled monetary system of any substance or of any size.
Do you think that's true even outside of the U.S. in smaller
Yes,
economies?
there's just a couple of things that governments cannot give up. They can't give up their monopoly and force, and they cannot give up their monetary system. So it's not going to happen. I mean, maybe in a rogue state somewhere where there's absolutely no infrastructure, maybe in Somalia or something like that, but it's not going to happen in where you have a reasonably functionable state.
Those are the best use cases so
If I
far.
could just add, if you look at the history of government's use of the power to print money, it's actually most critical in warfare, in wartime, because it generates a lot of revenue quickly. I'm amazed at the level of taxation that people will accept in order to fund welfare states. But to print a lot of money, to gather a lot of resources quickly, which is what they need to do in war, that's when the printing press becomes very valuable to governments, and that's why they're reluctant to give it up.
Good point. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I work in the field of national security and economics, and I kind of want to throw a curveball to the three of you, the firm of Laren, White, and Christensen. We have talked about cryptocurrencies working away from a statist conception. In Ecuador, the government is limited by the fact that they use the dollar, so they can't inflate. So they were trying to develop cryptocurrencies, and they were trying to develop electronic payment systems to be able to inflate. Currently, the government of Venezuela has something which no one has spoken about, something called a petro, based
Didn't
on...
have time to get it in, sorry.
Right, no,
Yeah.
obviously, constraints. The largest oil reserves in the world. And what I would put to the consulting firm, if I were the government of Venezuela or North Korea or Iran, and I'm trying to get around sanctions, and I'm trying to buy nuclear devices over here and over there and the rest of it, what advantages does a state have in developing some sort of cryptocurrency, and what are some of the negatives, if you will?
I think if it's a stable coin, like for multiple central banks working on doing, let's say, parallel e-kronas or e-dollars or whatever to just for efficiency reasons, and that can be done because you would have exactly the same credibility standing behind that as the fiat currency, whether you believe in it or not, but it would be the same. The problem in Venezuela and places like that is that for them to actually really use it for anything, it needs to gain some kind of adoption on a broader level, I think. But if you can force your population to use them, I don't see why that's the same as printing money and forcing people to use that, right? So it definitely has application for governments, and lots of central banks are working on various e-currency projects, but typically tied as a stable coin to their own currency in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I'd like to point out one other advantage if you're an evil government. We think of Bitcoin as anonymous, right? Because you have a wallet address, basically, that's a string of numbers that isn't intrinsically tied to who you are, not like your social security number or your name. Now, you lose that anonymity when you go through a bank because they can report this is your wallet address and this is who you are, so they can give that information to the government. If you don't have that anonymous entry point with blockchain, tracking what you do is trivially easy. And so if you're a criminal, you prefer cash or gold, actually. Like anything is better than blockchain unless you have an anonymous entry point into the blockchain.
Larry, last word?
And even just a fun fact, you mentioned Silk Road, right? Because even with an anonymous entry, you just have to one time fix that anonymous account to a real person, and you can track everything they did.
Perfectly.
So when FBI confiscated tons of Bitcoin from Silk Road, what did they do?
The proof is instant.
They could have burned them like that, and that made them disappear. But they sold them. They
Right.
sold them to a hedge fund.
They auctioned
because the FBI likes Bitcoin because a stupid criminal would use Bitcoin.
Yeah.
For $600 a Bitcoin, actually. Yeah.
I've written about the case in Ecuador, and the government was trying to derive revenue from it, but the lesson from that episode was that they couldn't get anybody to adopt it. They spent a lot of money promoting it. Nobody trusted the government of Ecuador. And the reason is, as you said, Ecuador is on a US dollar standard, so they were not a trustworthy issuer of claims to dollars. And in general, the idea of a central bank digital currency is a bad idea. There's no reason government should be involved in retail payments.
Thank you.
We have to stop. I just want to ask really quickly, by show of hands, did anybody change their mind on Bitcoin or the blockchain today? Good.
Couple people.
2, 3. Well, there's some hard opinions out there. Just a few. All right, let's give our panel a great hand. I really enjoyed this, and I learned a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all very much.